Hi everyone, and welcome to the podcast As Seen Onscreen, where we talk about the representation of minority groups in film and television. For today's episode, we will be talking about the representation of lesbian characters. This podcast episode is part of a research assignment for the Women and Gender Studies class I'm taking right now at the University of Saskatchewan. The class focuses on teaching about the images of gender and sexuality in popular culture. Now, before we dive in, I must admit that even though I do identify as a lesbian and have consumed a lot of lesbian media throughout my life, I don't know everything about lesbian representation. So that's why I'll be citing credible research articles and using textual examples from films and TV shows throughout this podcast. Furthermore, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming at this topic from a lens of privilege, being an educated white woman who comes from a supportive family. For me personally, I've noticed that lesbian representation in pop culture has both drastically increased and become more diversified over the last decade. 10 years ago, when I was a closeted kid, I longed for the type of lesbian representation that exists today. And while lesbian representation has come a long way since the debut of queer characters in film and TV, it still lacks an intersectional perspective. The ways that race, class, and physical ability intersect with lesbian identity continues to be underrepresented in today's media. And we're going to talk all about that on this episode. To better understand lesbian representation today, we need to start by taking a look back in history to the origins of lesbian portrayals on screen. In 1934, Hollywood introduced the Motion Picture Production Code, commonly referred to as the Hays Code. The code informed filmmakers what could be portrayed on screen and prohibited any depictions of homosexuality. While sapphic representation continued outside the United States when the Hays Code was in effect, Hollywood would not produce any queer films until the sexual liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. When queer cinema was reintroduced in Hollywood, it wasn't because production studios wanted to uplift queer voices. Of course not. What happened is that studio executives recognized that queer culture can be monetized and turn a profit. It wasn't until 1985 when American cinema finally saw its first major studio film directed by a lesbian about lesbians, and the film was called Desert Hearts. This was a significant moment for lesbian cinema, but it would take another 3 decades before lesbian media portrayals started becoming mainstream. The pop culture moment that many attribute to the increase of lesbian representation in the early 2000s was the moment when Ellen DeGeneres came out publicly on television. Her coming out made her the first openly lesbian lead character in TV history. And while Ellen has never been a lesbian celebrity that I particularly admired, she is one of the reasons why the early 2000s pop culture landscape increased lesbian representation. Unfortunately, the representation still tended to exploit female queerness for the male gaze. Popular shows during this time featuring storylines of lesbian women included Grey's Anatomy, Glee, and The L Word. Lesbian representation really started taking off and becoming mainstream from 2010 onwards. In the book, Girls Can Kiss Now, author Jill Gudowitz describes this period as the mainstreaming of sapphic media, and credits shows like Orange is the New Black and films like Carol as examples of mainstreaming lesbian narratives. And that leads us to today's sapphic media content. Even though society has generally become more accepting of lesbian characters, so many of them are still constructed for and by the male gaze. Let's talk about why that is. It's no secret that women are often sexualized in film and television, and lesbians are no exception. In the film industry, men are often in the director's chair telling stories with a male perspective. Because so many lesbian characters have been developed by males with the purpose of attracting male viewers, lesbian representation tends to result in the portrayal of lesbian stereotypes rather than well-rounded, diverse characters. According to research, there are 6 lesbian subtypes commonly reflected in the media. The 6 categories are the out lesbian, the closeted lesbian, the bisexual lesbian, the feminine lesbian, the butch lesbian, and the hot lesbian. In a study on lesbian perceptions of stereotypical media portrayals, the researchers found that the most reported lesbian subtypes in the media were the hot lesbian and the feminine lesbian. The reason that these two lesbian subtypes were the most reported was because of the power of the male gaze. This consequently affects butch, masculine-presenting women who are considered ugly by male viewers and thus represented even less on screen. Another trope resulting from the male gaze is that lesbian relationships are often portrayed as temporary and eventually dissolve as a character returns to heterosexuality. Lesbianism isn't a phase, nor is it an act of performance, so why does the media portray it in this way? It all comes back to the male gaze. It's ironic how men are so involved in the portrayal of lesbians on screen, considering how little lesbianism has to do with men. Even what's considered good lesbian representation is tainted with stereotypes. Let's look at Orange is the New Black as an example. Listen, I love this show, and I think it was groundbreaking when it was released in 2013. But while I appreciate this show and the diverse narratives it told, we must also be critical of the fact that all 6 lesbian subtypes can be found in this one show. On the one hand, how progressive that Orange is the New Black represented all the lesbian stereotypes and not just one, but on the other hand, it could have done better. We can identify these stereotypes using semiotic analysis, which means looking for signs in the show that communicate meaning. In this case, signs that communicate stereotypes. For example, there are ambiguous signs like tattoos and short haircuts that imply a character is lesbian, but the acting is also a process that generates signs. We know that Big Boo's character on the show is the butch lesbian because she acts tough like a man. We know that Lorna Morello is the bisexual lesbian because she has a confused look on her face whenever her lesbian friend Nikki wants to have sex with her. We know that Alex is the out lesbian because she acts confidently and initiates relationships with other women. And Piper Chapman is obviously the hot femme lesbian, not just because of her looks, but because of the way she uses that to her advantage. I think we should still give the show credit for making lesbian narratives an important part of each episode. Not only that, we also get to see the way that other identities intersect with their queerness. A character's skin color and social status are depicted in a way that intersected with their sexuality, and we need more of that. So much more of that. Research suggests that representation of white lesbians in the media seems to be growing, but my desire is to see representation not just grow in numbers, but grow in meaning. This means more narratives telling stories of queer women of color, disabled women, and those in lower income classes. That leads us to our most important topic on this episode, how an intersectional perspective is missing from lesbian representation. When I watch TV shows today with lesbian representation, I can't help but think, wow, I finally feel seen. According to GLAAD's Where We Are in TV report for 2021-2022, for the first time ever, lesbians represent the majority of LGBTQ+ characters on broadcast and cable TV. I love this news because it means that we're making progress as a society. But then I think, wow, I hope we're not just making lesbian representation for middle-class, straight-passing white women, aka people like myself. It's 2022. Of course there are white lesbian characters that I can relate to. But when I think about the broader community, I realize that the representation of lesbians is still very white and continues to lack in diversity. This is especially true for films because the film industry has traditionally been a harsh place for women in general, and even worse for lesbians. For some reason, studios just can't stop making lesbian period pieces. There are so many. And while I'm not really complaining, because seeing if two lesbians will do more than glance at each other is a thrill to watch, it makes me mad because it's never people of color cast in these period films. Off the top of my head, Carol, A Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Vita and Virginia, The World to Come, Lizzie, and Ammonite are all lesbian period films released between 2015 and 2020. And basically the entire cast of these films are white actors. Let's analyze the 2015 film Carol to better understand this form of lesbian cinema. To analyze this film, I'll be using Douglas Kellner's method of textual analysis. The film will be analyzed for its depiction of race, sexuality, gender, and economic status. Then we'll look at what messages it's sending and what the implications are. But first things first, I have to provide a disclaimer. I love Cate Blanchett, and specifically her work with Rooney Mara in the film Carol. I've seen this film so many times that I can basically quote the whole movie, which is Not that impressive considering the little amount of dialogue. But the point is, I know it well, which also means I know what's wrong with the film, and while I normally choose to look past its faults, I will boldly face them head on today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the storyline, Cate Blanchett stars as Carol, a wealthy suburban wife and mother who meets shopgirl Therese, played by Rooney Mara. It is love at first sight when Therese looks up from her sales counter to meet Carol Aired's gaze from across the room. The film follows these two women as they fall in love with each other in 1950s New York. It really is a beautiful film. However, there are definitely some yellow flags. There are no people of color in the cast, not even as secondary characters. The two women are aware of their feelings for each other, but neither identify themselves as lesbians. Therese, while not categorized as butch, has her gender marked as alien and non-normative when Carol refers to her as a strange girl flung out of space. Indeed, Therese's most distinct quality is not her femininity, but her youthfulness, as the film often plays with the stereotype of the inexperienced schoolgirl engaging with the predatory lesbian. It's as if race, sexuality, and gender are labels that fade into the background because their story exists in a fantasy scenario where these things don't impact the relationship. At times, we do see how the class difference between Carol and Therese affects their relationship, but that is the most we see of any intersecting of identities. Analyzing the sets also tells us things about the film. 1950s New York was a place of dyke bars, butch femme romances, police raids, and racial mixing. And instead of telling their story with that as the backdrop, the film depicts a lover's world. So what does this mean? What messages does it send? If Carol was the only film that exhibited the characteristics I've just described, I wouldn't have a problem. But so many of the lesbian period films I listed earlier would produce a similar analysis. These narratives give the impression that stories of white queer women are more important than stories where race, gender, and social class are explored in depth. Additionally, all of these lesbian period films are sending the message that it's okay to be gay as long as you're white. It's not that there are no lesbian films starring people of color, but those films don't receive as much attention at the box office or in the press, and thus white lesbianism is really the only thing that is coming into the mainstream. As Jill puts it in her book, narratives that eschew the real and present pains of the current queer experience aren't pushing the narrative forward. They're still erasing our stories, just in new, nuanced ways. Sometimes it feels like the film industry won't ever move forward, but then I watch a new movie that gives me hope. The film Everything Everywhere All at Once came out earlier this year, and it made me excited again for the future of lesbian cinema. The film centers on a Chinese-American family. While the movie isn't in-your-face gay, the daughter in the family identifies as a lesbian and struggles with her identity in relationship to her family, ethnicity, and social class. It's a film told through an intersectional perspective, and guess what? Audiences loved it. The film industry is still working towards more diversity and inclusion, but I feel like we are finally seeing some well-rounded lesbian characters in blockbuster films. This is important because representation in the media has the ability to reduce real-world prejudice. Now, before we cover the last topic, let's take a break and play a short game that I'm going to call Is She a Lesbian? This game is inspired by all of the queer-coded characters in film and television that, despite exhibiting many queer qualities, were never identified as queer. Here's how the game works. I'm going to list a character from a movie and the actor that played them. This character has been coded as queer, but I have personally decided if they exhibit enough qualities to be considered a legit lesbian. I'll give you a few moments to decide if that character is a lesbian before sharing my answer. It's totally subjective, but let's have some fun. Ready? Alright, let's begin. Okay, first off, we have Rosie O'Donnell playing Doris Murphy in the 1992 film A League of Their Own. Is she a lesbian? Yes, I would say that she is. Honestly, the entire film is very queer-coded. I mean, it's a movie about women playing baseball. Of course there are going to be lesbians. The thing about this movie is that it was released in the early 1990s when it was still taboo to be gay and when positive representation of lesbian characters didn't really exist in mainstream media. This film probably would have received a lot of pushback if there were explicit lesbian characters. So instead, some characters were coded as queer by the way that they acted more like a man, their butch clothing, and even the deeper voice. And in my opinion, Doris Murphy's character exhibited these qualities the best. Okay, next up is Cate Blanchett playing Lou Miller in the 2018 film Ocean's 8. Is she a lesbian? Yes, Lou is definitely a lesbian. This is another movie centering on a large female cast, so again, there's gonna be at least one lesbian. And while the movie doesn't explore Lou's sexuality, it's obvious in the way that the character acts, dresses, and talks. Lou is constantly flirting with Debbie, Sandra Bullock's character. She's always dressed in these amazing power suits, and she's got this cool, butch, biker chick persona. Unlike the film A League of Their Own, this movie was released during the mainstreaming of lesbian media, so it definitely could have explicitly identified Lou as a lesbian. However, there's less of a need for labels these days, so it's left up to the viewer to decide how Lou identifies. Moving on to the last one, we have Ursula, voiced by Pat Carroll in Disney's 1989 film The Little Mermaid. Is she a lesbian? Yes, the animated Ursula is another lesbian. The game is rigged. Everyone is a lesbian. Disney has a long history of queer coding their villains, and Ursula isn't the only character subjected to it. It's not great that evil is being related to queerness in these characters, but one cannot deny Ursula's lesbian characteristics. She was actually based on the famous drag queen Divine, but her overtly sexualized behavior, low husky voice, and even her short haircut are all identical characteristics linked to lesbian identity. Her character directly contrasts the sweet, feminine mermaid Ariel. Alright, that wraps up our game, and remember when I mentioned semiotic analysis earlier? Well, all of these characters can be identified as lesbians because of how they communicate signs, and the meanings associated with the signs signify lesbian identity. Now, even though this game was pretty silly, it leads us to our last topic about why representation matters. Why do we look for signs that identify queer characters? Why are we so desperate to be seen on screen? I have identified two major reasons why representation matters. The first reason is that viewing queer characters on screen is proven to reduce prejudice against queer people in the real world. Research studies have found that there is a positive relationship between viewing gay characters on television and endorsement of gay equality. An influential psychologist named Gordon Allport is known for his contact thesis theory, which explains that under the right conditions, interpersonal contact is one of the best ways to reduce prejudice between majority and minority groups. Researchers have built on this idea and argue that even imagined contact with characters in film and television can change perceptions of minority groups. And that's exactly what's happening for queer people. Queer media has the power to create empathy, awareness, and equality throughout society for the 2S LGBTQ+ population. When we take a look at the political economy today and compare it to 30 years ago, before the mainstreaming of lesbian and queer content, these are two completely different worlds. Today, 2S LGBTQ+ folks are everywhere, refusing to hide. 30 years ago, the queer community was not welcomed into the mainstream as we are today. The representation of queer characters in the media has helped our society become more tolerant, but there is still work to do. The quality of the portrayal of queer characters matters, not just the amount. Remember the signs that signify stereotypes? Remember intersectionality? Telling diverse narratives about queer people is really the best way to reduce prejudice, because when we tell stories from an intersectional perspective, we can reduce prejudice on more than one level. We're not just addressing sexuality, but we are also addressing race, social class, physical ability, and more. One TV show that tells queer narratives through an intersectional framework is the 2020 remake of A League of Their Own. While it's based on the film, the TV series also tells the stories of a black lesbian woman, a trans man, and a whole team of both butch and femme lesbians. I give it a gold star for diversity. The other reason why representation matters so much is that it helps 2S LGBTQ+ individuals understand and accept their sexuality. Positive and realistic portrayals can be beneficial to individuals who seek information about sexual identity, especially to those who are coming out. Coming out as a queer person can be really difficult and scary, and it helps when there are queer characters that you can look to and be comforted by. Queer representation is especially important for those who don't know any queer people in their own life. I've experienced this myself. I remember seeing a lesbian on TV for the first time, and it honestly changed my life in such a positive way. Representation matters. It matters a lot. It's why we need less lesbian characters created by the male gaze. It's why we need more lesbian characters whose intersecting identities are represented. It's why we need more characters explicitly identified as lesbians. Everyone deserves to feel seen and understood. So that concludes this episode of the podcast. I'm Emily Parent, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to As Seen Onscreen.